August 15, 1971, Camp David. The United States closes the gold window. Most people did not understand what had just happened. It sounded technical, temporary, administrative, but it was one of those quiet decisions that changes the emotional structure of an era. Before that moment, the dollar was not just money, it was a promise with an anchor. After that moment, it became something else, something more powerful and more dangerous. A global claim backed not by gold, but by military reach, financial depth, and political faith. Most people think dollar failure would look dramatic. A crash, a panic, empty shelves, one moment when everyone realizes the game is over. But that is not how reserve systems usually decay. They do not fail all at once. They stop telling the truth, slowly. Savings buy less, wages stretch less, homes move further away. Stability becomes more expensive every year. The currency still exists, the institutions still function, the markets still open in the morning. But the measuring stick changes. And when the measuring stick changes, society changes with it. And this is the part most people miss. Dollar failure is not mainly about whether the note in your wallet still works. It is about whether the system behind it still converts effort into security. It is about whether debt is still building the future, or whether debt has shifted into something else, something more desperate, something more political, preserving old promises, protecting asset prices, maintaining prestige, postponing pain. That is the shift that matters. Debt moving from growth to survival. And once that shift happens, money changes character. It becomes less a mirror of real production and more a management tool for decline. The dollar is still dominant, that is true. It is still the world's main reserve currency. But dominance is not immunity. In fact, reserve status can hide fragility because it lets a country borrow longer, delay adjustment longer, and spread the cost of its contradictions across the rest of the world. So this is not a story about some theatrical overnight collapse. It is a story about something slower, quieter, more dangerous. A system that survives institutionally while weakening materially. A system that stays credible at the top while becoming harder to live inside at the bottom. And if that is the kind of world we are moving into, then the real question is not whether the dollar disappears. The real question is what survives when the dollar begins to lose honesty. What survives when paper claims become political tools? What survives when purchasing power erodes before institutions do? What survives when the middle class realizes too late that nominal wealth and real security are not the same thing? History gives a clear answer. Not every asset survives this kind of transition. In fact, most people are not destroyed because they owned nothing. They are destroyed because they owned the wrong kind of thing, at the wrong stage of the cycle. When debt funds growth, paper claims can flourish. But when debt shifts from growth to survival, scarcity starts to matter more than narrative. When debt shifts from growth to survival, the assets closest to necessity begin separating from the assets closest to financial engineering. And when debt shifts from growth to survival, the middle class learns the hardest lesson in economics. What looks safe on paper can become dangerous in real life. People usually think currency decline is about exchange rates. They look at the dollar against the euro, the yen, the pound, and if the chart still looks strong, they assume the system is fine. But for ordinary people, that is not the real chart. The real chart is the one between wages and life, between income and rent, between savings and groceries, between work and the cost of staying normal. That is where everything changes. A system can keep a strong currency image internationally while becoming weaker domestically. It can remain globally powerful while daily life becomes financially thinner. That is what people feel when prices rise faster than breathing room, when bills get harder to pay, when medical care gets delayed, when every month still looks manageable on paper and exhausting in reality. Now widen the frame. When interest costs rise and debt keeps building, the temptation becomes obvious. Hold rates below reality. Tolerate inflation. Stretch the currency. Avoid the honest reset. And here is the deeper problem. A country can survive high debt for a long time if that debt is building future output. If it is financing productive capacity, infrastructure, energy, industry, or innovation, then debt still points forward. But when debt stops funding growth and starts funding survival, everything changes. Then money itself becomes political. Then the system is no longer just trying to grow, it is trying to preserve itself. History has seen this before. London, 1925. Britain returns to gold at the old pre-war parity. On paper, it looked like strength. It looked like discipline. It looked like imperial seriousness. But Keynes saw something else. He saw a strong currency being forced onto a weaker industrial base. He saw prestige being defended at the expense of production. He saw a financial image being preserved, while the real economy beneath it absorbed the pain. That pattern matters because prestige currencies often break workers first. Elites experience them as credibility. Financial centers experience them as status. Creditors experience them as discipline. Workers experience them as unemployment. Export sectors experience them as pressure. Industry experiences them as slow suffocation. Now move to the United States. Post-war America built a middle class when wages, production, housing access, and national power still moved in the same direction. Levittown in 1951 was not just a suburb, it was a contract in physical form. One income, one home, one family, a future that still looked reachable. That was not luxury, that was the American middle class promise. But once the system shifted away from wages and toward assets, away from production and toward financial expansion, that contract started to hollow out. Manufacturing once acted like a bridge between labor and ownership. It gave millions of households a way to convert work into stability. But over time, that bridge weakened. Jobs disappeared, bargaining power declined, and the economy became more financial, more asset-driven, more dependent on rising paper values than rising real security. And this is the part most people miss. The middle class does not disappear only when incomes fall. It disappears when effort stops converting into durable security. It disappears when work still happens, but ownership moves further away. It disappears when the rules of the system quietly change, but the language of the system does not. People are still told to work hard, save, invest, and wait, but the machine underneath those instructions is not the same machine anymore. So if paper claims become less trustworthy in that kind of system, what holds up better? The first answer is gold. Gold confuses modern investors because it does not behave like a productive business. It does not innovate. It does not pay a dividend. It does not promise growth. But gold is not mainly an income asset. Gold is a monetary referendum. It performs when trust in policy, trust in paper, or trust in restraint begins to weaken. It does not need to promise growth. It only needs to remain outside the machinery that is diluting everything else. That is why central banks keep buying it. That is why it returns in periods of sovereign stress. That is why it matters when debt shifts from growth to survival. Gold survives because it is monetary memory. It remembers that governments prefer erosion to confession. It remembers that promises expand faster than discipline. It remembers that when a state cannot shrink its obligations honestly, it becomes tempted to make money itself less honest. Gold is not there to make every year exciting. It is there because, when paper credibility weakens, something outside the liability structure starts to matter again. Here is the simple version. Gold survives because it does not need the system to behave. And when the system is under pressure, that matters. The second answer is productive land. Not any land, not speculative land, not just expensive real estate with a good story attached to it, productive land. Land tied to something people must still consume when they cut everything else. Food is not optional. Soil is not a narrative. Productive land does not depend on central bank credibility to remain useful. It exists inside the real economy. It can generate rent. It can hold strategic value. It can reprice with necessity. That does not mean it is risk-free. It is not. Weather matters. Leverage matters. Policy matters. Timing matters. But productive land is fundamentally different from a long-duration paper claim. Put simply, productive land survives because paper can be printed. Acreage cannot. And there is a social layer to this too. Housing used to sit near the emotional center of middle-class stability. For decades, it was the asset that allowed ordinary households to build balance sheet strength over time. But now even that world is splitting apart. Access to real assets has become more class-dependent. What used to feel normal now feels gated. And when access to shelter, land, and ownership moves further away from wages, the meaning of real assets changes. They are no longer just investments. They become social dividing lines. That brings us to the third answer, commodity exposure. This is where the modern portfolio starts to look fragile. For years, people were trained to believe that a diversified basket of financial assets would solve almost everything. Stocks for growth, bonds for safety, some cash for flexibility, maybe real estate for inflation. That framework worked in a world shaped by disinflation, globalization, and falling rates. It worked when paper assets lived inside a regime of monetary trust. But if the regime changes, then the winners can change with it. Commodity exposure matters because it lives closer to necessity. Energy, metals, agriculture, fuel, transport inputs, industrial materials. These are not abstract claims. These are the raw materials of civilization. And when money weakens, this is often where reality pushes back first. When fuel rises, your life gets narrower. When food rises, your choices get fewer. When materials rise, the future embedded in homes, vehicles, construction, and infrastructure gets more expensive. That is why commodity exposure matters. It sits near the point where monetary decay becomes physical cost. Owning broad equities is not the same thing as owning scarcity. That distinction matters. Businesses can struggle under inflation pressure. Margins get squeezed. Valuations compress. Debt becomes harder to carry. Consumers pull back. But the inputs the system cannot function without often reprice first. This is where paper meets reality. And in a world where debt is increasingly used to maintain old promises instead of building new abundance, reality eventually charges a premium. So the three assets that tend to survive better in this kind of environment are not magical. They are not perfect. They are not free from volatility or risk, but they share one critical trait. They are closer to the real world than most paper claims. Gold, because it sits outside the liability structure. Productive land, because it links scarcity to utility. Commodity exposure, because it sits near the repricing of necessity. Three different routes, one underlying logic. And now we come to the real tragedy. The people most exposed to this kind of decline usually notice last. The wealthy can arbitrage, institutions can hedge, states can delay. But the middle class lives in the layer where policy abstraction becomes lifestyle compression. That is where a weakening currency shows up first, not in dramatic headlines, in quieter ways, in the grocery bill, in the cost of insurance, in the rent increase, in the home that no longer looks reachable, in the medical procedure that gets delayed, in the savings account that still exists but no longer feels like protection. This is not apocalypse, it is managed deterioration. A quieter confiscation, a slower transfer, a polite reduction in what money can still do. And this is the part most people miss. Dollar decline does not have to mean dollar disappearance. It can mean the dollar remains dominant while your purchasing power, savings power, and bargaining power quietly deteriorate. It can mean the system keeps its promises in nominal terms while breaking them in real terms. It can mean the institutions survive by asking households to absorb the adjustment invisibly. So if you remember just one thing, remember this. The real warning is not debt alone. It is debt shifting from growth to survival. That is the phrase to hold on to. Debt shifting from growth to survival. Because once that shift happens, you should stop asking which asset is fashionable. You should start asking which asset still belongs to the real world. The final warning is not dramatic. It is worse. Because dramatic warnings can still wake people up. Slow warnings usually do not. Currencies do not collapse suddenly. They slowly stop telling the truth. By the time people debate collapse, the system has already chosen its path. And by the time most households feel certain that the old bargain is gone, the repricing has already happened. If this changed the way you see money, safety, and what real protection actually looks like, subscribe. Not for panic, for clarity. Because the next decade will not reward the people who memorize headlines. It will reward the people who understand the structure underneath them. And when you are done, ask yourself one question. In a weakening currency regime, what matters more? Monetary protection, productive ownership, or exposure to scarcity itself? Because history already has the answer.